I'm Gary Sposito. I am a member of the commission. Like this, following. I'm a member. I am also a member of the commission, like the previous two moderators, and like the previous moderator, immediately previous one, I was a member of the library committee. In fact, I believe I was a member under the chair, who is currently the director of the Bancroft Library. And I also serve on the advisory board for the Biosciences and Natural Resources Library. So I'm into libraries. This session, I think, will be very interesting. Envisioning the role of the library in the 21st century, the research library in the 21st century. And we have, I think, the two finest people in the country, maybe everywhere, to speak on this. And I'm going to introduce them briefly, both of them, and then they will proceed in turn, and then after that we'll have questions and so on. First, we're going to have Robert Darnton, whom you've heard from this morning, actually heard from both of them this morning. Carl H. Forsheimer, university professor and university librarian at Harvard, specialist in French Revolution and the Enlightenment, who's received many, many wonderful honors. MacArthur Fellowship, for example. He is a Chevalier de la Légion d'Honneur. He also received the National Humanities Medal. He has written extensively about books, about libraries, and so on. I think most of you know that he's also been talking and thinking a lot about the digital world and the book. He's one of the founders of the history of the book as a serious scientific discipline. I have to interject one quick thing here. I was in this room last Friday for a different conference. It was one on ecopoetics, and the room was just as full as it is now, with people from all over the world, the US and the world. This is an emerging new field. It's a synthesis, obviously, of two different fields. And I was thinking to myself, how is this going to be handled by the Library of the Future, these emerging fields that are growing up everywhere in scholarship? We had hundreds of papers from grad students from everywhere. And what's going to become of books of poetry, those slim volumes that every one of us has in our library at home under the new regime? I hope we'll get some answers today to those questions. Let me continue. Professor Darnton's last three books I thought had wonderful titles. One of them is called The Case for the Book. Another is called The Devil in the Holy Water. And the third one, Poetry and the Police. And all three seem very relevant to our times today. Paul Courant, excuse me, is Arthur F. Turnow Professor, Harold T. Shapiro Collegiate Professor of Public Policy, Professor of Economics, Professor of Information, University of Michigan Librarian, and Dean of Libraries. He works on the interface of economics and public policy. He's been interested in this for a long time. Near to my heart is he's worked on the relationship between economic growth and environmental restoration or quality. Lately, he has been studying the economics of libraries and their archives and the changes in the system of scholarly communication toward the digital realm. So again, we have expertise in this very, very important area. So first, please welcome Robert Darnton.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I love Berkeley. I love Berkeley's library, all libraries actually, or almost all libraries. But it's a wonderful occasion. You are facing really important questions. You're facing them squarely. You're consulting people, and I'm glad to be part of this general process. I'm here, though, really to talk about the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, as you see from the slide. And I thought I would begin in an outrageously general meta-historical vein. So, begging your pardon, I would like to argue that the Digital Public Library of America, which actually will be launched very soon, April 18th, it will go online, that it represents the confluence of two currents that have shaped American civilization, utopianism and pragmatism. The utopian tendency marked the Republic at its birth because the United States was produced by a revolution, and revolutions release utopian energy. That is, the conviction that the way things are is not the way they have to be. When things fall apart violently and by collective action, they create the possibility of putting them back together according to higher principles. The American revolutionaries drew their inspiration from the Enlightenment and also from other sources, of course, including unorthodox varieties of religious experience and bloody-minded convictions about their birthright as free-born Englishmen. Take these ingredients, mix well, and you get the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, radical assertions of principle that would never make it through Congress today. Yet the revolutionaries were practical men who had a job to do. When the Articles of Confederation proved inadequate to get it done, they set out to build a more perfect union and began again with a constitution designed to empower an effective state while at the same time keeping it in check. Checks and balances, the Federalist Papers, sharp elbows in a scramble for wealth and power, never mind about slavery and slave wages. The founders were tough and tough-minded. Now, how do these two tendencies converge in the Digital Public Library of America? The DPLA harkens back to the 18th century. What could be more utopian than a project to make the cultural heritage of humanity available to all humans? What could be more pragmatic than the designing of a system to link up millions of megabytes and deliver them to readers in the form of easily accessible texts? Above all, the DPLA expresses an Enlightenment faith in the power of communication. Jefferson and Franklin, the champion of the Library of Congress, a printer who became a philosopher-statesman, shared a profound belief that the health of the Republic depended on the free flow of ideas. And you've heard from Kevin about the importance of belief. Well, that's where this country began. A faith in, well, the power of the printed word. Because Jefferson and Franklin and the other founders all knew that the diffusion of ideas depended on the printing press. And yet the technology of printing had hardly changed since the days of Gutenberg. And this technology was not powerful enough to spread the word through a society with a low rate of literacy and a high rate of poverty. Thanks to the internet and a pervasive, if imperfect, system of education, we now can realize the dream of Jefferson and Franklin. We have the technological and economic resources to make all the holdings of all our research libraries accessible to all our fellow citizens, and in fact to everyone in the world with access to the World Wide Web. That is the mission of the DPLA. Now, put so boldly, it sounds too grand. We can easily get carried away by utopian rhetoric about the library of libraries, the mother of all libraries, the modern Library of Alexandria. To build the DPLA, we must tap the can-do, hands-on, workaday pragmatism of the American tradition. Let me therefore describe what the DPLA is and what it will offer to the American public at the time of its launch and what it will become in the near future. How to think of it? Well, not as a great edifice topped with a dome sitting on a gigantic database. The DPLA will be a distributed system of electronic links that will make the collections of research libraries available effortlessly and free of charge to readers everywhere. To make it work, we must think big and begin small. The collections at first will be limited to holdings in a few libraries that have already digitized some of their most important books and manuscripts. Around this core, it will grow, gradually accumulating material of all kinds until it will function as, well, if I may use the expression, a national digital library. The trajectory of its development can be understood from the history of its origin. And it actually does have a history, although it's not yet 3 years old. It germinated from a conference held at Harvard on October 1st, 2010, a small affair involving 40 persons, most of them heads of foundations and libraries. In a letter of invitation, I included a one-page memo about the basic idea. And I've read it over recently. It's rather an odd experience. The idea was, quote, to make the bulk of world literature available to all citizens free of charge by creating a grand coalition of foundations and research libraries, end quote. Now, in retrospect, of course, that does sound suspiciously utopian. But everyone at this meeting agreed that the job was worth doing and that we could get it done. You've probably seen these cartoons at meetings where people draw cartoons as they listen to talks. We don't have a cartoonist here, but maybe next time, Carlo. We also agreed on a short description of it, which by now has become a mission statement. The DPLA, we resolved, would be, quote, an open, distributed network of comprehensive online resources that would draw on the nation's living heritage from libraries, universities, archives, and museums in order to educate, inform, and empower everyone in the current and future generations, end quote. Who, you might ask, authorized this self-appointed group to undertake such an ambitious enterprise? Answer, nobody. We believed that it required private initiative and that it would never get off the ground if we waited for the government to act. Therefore, we appointed a steering committee, a secretariat located at the Berkman Center in Harvard, and 6 work streams scattered around the country which began to study and debate key issues: governance, finance, technology, infrastructure, copyright, the scope and content of the collections, and the audience to be envisioned. So I'm just showing you some of the cartoons that illustrate the themes that came up in a whole series of meetings of these work streams and plenary meetings of the entire DPLA. Now, the work streams grew and developed a momentum of their own, drawing on voluntary labor, crowdsourcing, discussion through websites, listservs, open meetings, and highly focused workshops. About 1,200 persons became actively involved, but thousands more participated through an endless, noisy debate conducted through the internet. Plenary meetings in Washington, D.C., in San Francisco, in Chicago drew large crowds and a much larger virtual audience thanks to the texting and tweeting and streaming and other electronic connections. There developed gradually a sense of community, 21st century style, that is, open, inchoate, virtual, yet real, because held together as a body by an electronic nervous system built into the web. The talk took place while groups got down to work. An open invitation to a beta sprint produced proposals for the technological infrastructure from 40 volunteers. They got no financial reward. We just said, come and give us your technological ideas. And the response was amazing. Actually, 60 people originally planned to do this. And they had 3 months to come up with bright computer code. After several rounds of testing and reworking, a platform was developed which will aggregate metadata from library collections throughout the country. As this slide illustrates, metadata from hubs with content scattered around the country will be fed into the back end of a platform and aggregated in a repository. On the front end, an application programming interface will make it possible for all kinds of apps to develop linkages from the hubs and to transmit the content to users. So the user-friendly front end will make it possible for any reader anywhere to consult works that used to be stored on inaccessible shelves or locked up in treasure rooms. This slide shows you what will appear on the user's screen, although it's just a trial mock-up, so don't take it literally. Meanwhile, several of the country's greatest libraries prepared to make their greatest treasures available to the public through specially designed links to the DPLA. Those works will be accessible online at the launch on April 18th, but they are only the beginning of aggregated offerings that will grow organically as far as the budget and copyright permit. Of course, growth must be sustainable, but the greatest foundations in the country have expressed sympathy for the project. Several of them, the Sloan, Arcadia, Mellon, Knight, and Soros foundations, in addition to the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute of Museum and Library Services, have financed the first 3 years of the DPLA's existence. If a dozen foundations combined forces, allotting a set amount from each to an annual budget, they could create the digital equivalent of the Library of Congress within a decade. Now, the main impediment to the DPLA's growth is actually legal, not financial. I'm convinced we can find the money, but what are we going to do about copyright? Well, fortunately, you heard Pamela Samuelson discuss that subject, so I won't go into it in a lot of detail. But I should remind you that copyright laws could exclude everything published after 1964, most works published after 1923, and some that go back as far, believe it or not, as 1873. Some recent court cases that Pamela mentioned open up the possibility that the fair use provision of the Copyright Act of 1976 could be extended to make more recent books available for certain purposes. And if, as expected, the DPLA excludes books that are still selling on the market, and you know most books exhaust their commercial viability within a few years, in fact, within a few weeks, authors and publishers might grant the exercise of their rights to the DPLA. So this could apply to a lot of you sitting in this room. That's what Pamela meant when she talked about the Authors Alliance. We authors, most of us, don't make any money from the books we publish. Maybe we make a little bit. I published a book in 1968, still in print, and it's enough for me to take my wife out to dinner once every 2 years. So let's face it, most academics and most authors are academics, and there are lots of non-academic authors who are in the same situation. We want to have readers. And so I think the Authors Alliance really has a great future. Doesn't it, Pam? We will make it happen because it's in the interest of authors to have readers. And we can provide for the very tiny proportion of books that are still selling after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You could build a moving wall that would keep the DPLA out of the commercial marketplace and therefore would not be a threat to publishers and authors with copyrights. In any case, I really don't feel that we can wait for courts to untangle legalities before creating an effective administration for this bright idea that began in October 2010. The informal secretariat at Harvard is being replaced by a nonprofit organization organized according to the 501c3 provisions of the tax code. The steering committee has been succeeded by a board of trustees, and the 6 working streams will evolve into a committee system with carefully defined functions. The choice of an executive director will soon be announced, and this is a crucial choice. I think we can announce it within a week. It's really important. And furthermore, 2 staff members have already been hired. Now you might say 2 staff members, not impressive, but you've got to begin somewhere, and we've got a great beginning of a serious administration. These first steps will not lead to the creation of a top-heavy bureaucracy. On the contrary, the distributed character of the DPLA means its operations will be spread across the country. Its growing collection of metadata, and Harvard has already made available 14 million openly accessible metadata records, will be stored in computer clouds, and its activities will be funneled through hubs that are now located in 7 states and that someday will exist in all states. 40 already are developing statewide digital libraries. So there's a lot going on all over the country. What we want to do is to harness it and direct it in the interest of the general American public. Service hubs will help communities to develop digital sources and states to aggregate them. With carefully coordinated assistance from representatives of the DPLA, local libraries and historical societies will be able to scan, curate, and preserve local materials, Civil War mementos, high school yearbooks, family correspondence, anything that they have in their collections or that their constituents want to fetch out of attics and trunks. This slide shows some of the digital exhibitions that are being prepared with the help of the hubs. You probably can't read it too well, but there's a huge amount going on to try to mobilize local resources around themes that speak and resonate to local communities, but that also could interest people on a national scale. So as it develops, digital empowerment at the grassroots level will reinforce the national collection building, and the integrated national collections will be linked with those in other countries. The DPLA has designed its infrastructure to be interoperable with that of Europeana, a super aggregator sponsored by the European Union, which coordinates linkages among the collections of 27 European countries. Within a generation, there should be a worldwide network that will bring nearly all the holdings of all the libraries and museums within the range of everyone on the globe. Well, I'm, again, lapsing into utopian language, so you should beware of this, but there is this utopian energy behind the whole thing. And to provide a glimpse into this future, Europeana and the DPLA have produced a joint digital exhibition on the theme of immigration from Europe to the US, which will go online for all of you to inspect at the time of the April 18th launch. Now, of course, expansion at the local or the global level depends on the ability of libraries and other institutions to develop their own digital databases. And that is a long-term, uneven process which requires infusions of money and energy. As it takes place, content hubs of the DPLA will coordinate the availability of the material by aggregating its metadata. We can expect great stockpiles of digital riches to grow up in locations scattered around the country. Many actually already exist because the largest research libraries have already digitized enormous sectors of their collections, and they will become hubs in themselves. For example, in serving as a hub, Harvard plans to make available to the DPLA 75 rare medieval manuscripts, thousands of diaries, letters, and other documents from the colonial period, 3,500 daguerreotypes, along with the first photographs of the moon and of African-born slaves, original scores by Bach, Mozart, and Schubert, 976 early scientific drawings of fish and various vertebrates, 1,000 maps, many from the Revolutionary period, and 450 chapbooks and penny dreadfuls, an early genre of popular literature produced during sensational trials. The question I'd like to raise now, though, in ending is, how will such material be put to use? I would like to end with a final example. About 14 million students are struggling to get an education in community colleges. That's at least as many as are enrolled in all the country's four-year colleges and universities. But many of these students, and many more students in high schools, do not have access to a decent library. The DPLA can provide them with a spectacular digital collection, and it can tailor its offerings to their needs. At one time or other, to give you this final example, nearly every student comes in contact with a poem by Emily Dickinson, who probably qualifies as America's favorite poet. But Dickinson's poems are especially problematic. Nearly all the manuscript, only a few of them were actually appeared in Emily Dickinson's lifetime, and they were horribly mangled. But almost all the manuscript copies of them are stored in Harvard's Houghton Library, and these manuscript versions of the poems pose important puzzles because they contain quirky punctuation, capitalization, spacing, and other touches that have profound implications for their meaning. Harvard has digitized the originals. It's combined them with the most important printed editions, one edited by Thomas H. Johnson in 1955 and one edited by Ralph W. Franklin in 1981, and it's added supplementary documentation in an Emily Dickinson archive, which it will make available through the DPLA. This online archive will enrich the experience of students at every level of the educational system. Teachers will be able to make selections from it and to adjust those selections to the needs of their classes. By paying close attention to different versions of a poem, the students will begin to appreciate the way poetry works. They will sharpen their sensitivity to language in general, and the lessons they learn will help them gain possession of their cultural heritage. It may be a small step, but it will be a pragmatic advance into the world of knowledge, which Jefferson, in a utopian vein, described as the common property of mankind. Thank you.
Or you could put a picture of Bob up there, and then I would look erudite. It's hard to follow Bob Darnton, to put it mildly. Here I am. I was asked to talk about the future of the library, a vision of what it might look like. It's interesting when you talk about future. Is that 10 years or 20 or 30? Sure, it's some number like that. Probably more like 10, although there are lots of things that I thought 10 years ago would have happened by now that haven't. So it might be more like 20. And I want to start the sort of main thing I have to say, and it's been said a couple of times already today, is comes from the logic of the DPLA, which carries over to many digital library projects and activities, and I'll talk about how it fits, which I'll surely get wrong. So nothing I say about the future will be exactly right. I'm confident about that. And it has to do with a phrase that Peter used this morning, the difference between having and having access. And the academic library of the future will be still a lot about having, but relatively more, and certainly absolutely more than now, about having access. And people who aren't from the library world think that that ought to sort of be a trivially easy move. It's not. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. And I also want to talk about the library as space on campus and how it's used and some of the implications for student learning and experience, mostly directed at undergraduates, because I actually think of graduate students as faculty who have better working conditions but lower pay. But that's just my so graduate students feel very hard-pressed, and they're right. But actually, it's when you stop being a graduate student, I promise you, you'll look back on it and say, boy, that was great. Yeah. But the big change, the academic library now has to work in the context of all sorts of things that are outside it, but that it wants to, should make use of. And so we have complicated relationships with other entities, including other libraries. And I'm going to illustrate a little bit by talking about, of all things, the card catalog. So not that long ago, when most of the people in this room and on these panels were learning to use libraries, there was a thing called the catalog. And in fact, we called it the card catalog because it was on cards. There's still a version of it that isn't on cards. And it did two things that were the same thing and now aren't. It provided a detailed list of what the library owned, right? It was an inventory device, right? It was a list of all the stuff we had. And it provided information valuable to users about the things that the library owned. So it told you what you could get at, and indeed provided some very useful discovery tools. There's tremendously good scholarship in a good card catalog. It's good scholarship attached to an inventory of parts. It's a very nice combination. Of course, it did a bad job with serials. Everybody does a bad job with serials. Serials are just hard to catalog and find very well. And indeed, in the digital age where we can index them and use certain tools that look at things at the article level, it's almost beginning to get reasonably good at finding serials, but we're still not very good at the combination of getting the inventory right and finding the serials. We might get back to that, probably won't. There was an approximate identity in the library of what you could quickly deliver to the patron, and this list. The library would buy a book or a journal or something else, catalog it, put it on the shelf, or put it in the vault, put it in the microform room, and stood ready to let people who had the right rights of access to use it. And because of the nature of the way the collections worked, the catalog was both a collection management tool and a discovery tool, and nobody needed to ask the question, so is there a difference between what's in the catalog, what should be in the catalog? Well, what should be in the catalog is the stuff we have, and it's got this nice list. So the DPLA is going to be a library that holds very little content, mostly metadata content. There might be a few, I can imagine it doing a few projects where it actually owns them, but that's not the plan. It will tell us where to go in a good way, and help us get there. It'll provide its depositors with help and with forms for getting content to users, but it won't hold very much content. Query: should the things that are in the DPLA be part of the catalog at the University of California, Berkeley? Answer: complicated question. The HathiTrust Digital Library, which I'll talk about in a moment a little more, provides reading and downloading access to all of its 80 or so members, which are our university libraries of various sorts, for public domain works, well over 3 million of them, and reading access to everyone, whether they're members or not, and search access to almost everyone. There's funny international and domestic copyright issues, of course. The California Digital Library is a member of the HathiTrust, founding member, with the implication that all of these works, many from elsewhere, not from the University of California at all, are part of what your library can deliver to you. And indeed, you can deliver to yourself by virtue of an invisible, essentially invisible to the user, authentication process that's managed by the library and the IT operation, and nobody has to know how that works except when it doesn't. And it mostly does. And so anybody can get there, and in fact, almost anybody in the country can get to the public domain works in the HathiTrust. But again, from the perspective of the University of California at Berkeley, do the public domain works, which you absolutely have access to, belong in your catalog? If you do, the numbers go up by 3 million, right? And then you're even bigger than the University of Alberta. Which, by the way, is the second largest academic library in Canada. I'm not sure where that gets you, but that's what it is. So the Digital Public Library of America will provide a portal for delivery, and it will have metadata for sure, although probably won't require the details of provenance and such that we require in academic libraries, because academics care about those things. It'll be more interested in finding, I think. There are lots of other entities like this. There's the Text Creation Partnership. There's Early English Books Online, right? There's dozens of them. And they provide resources to the academy, to academic libraries, but they aren't owned by the library in the same sense that the traditional collections are. They have different business models. They're essential to scholarship, and somebody has to figure out how to navigate them well, and that somebody is almost certainly the academic library. So there'll be more and more resources that will serve academic work and need some attention, provenance, citation, replicability, authority, from the academic library, but that aren't owned by the local library. And it makes you, and I'm new to this business, it makes you just sort of pine for the good old days, where the stuff that was in the library was the stuff that was in the catalog, and the stuff that was in the catalog was the stuff that was in the library. But that's not coming back, and it's probably just as well. And for a great deal of the journal literature and increasing amounts of other commercially delivered literature, we lease it rather than own it. We seem to be pretty jolly about putting that in the catalog if it comes from a traditional publisher, but we actually don't, in many cases, own it. And that poses very serious problems for preservation down the road, as the owners, the publishers, may or may not take good care of it. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Whereas with print, you know, if you own it, you might not take good care of it, but you'll notice right quick. It's not on the shelf, and there are funny things crawling around in it. So that's another problem that should get solved. That problem, many of the problems I'm talking about, actually are best solved at consortial levels, because there are many things that libraries, different libraries, can share across different places. So there will be, the academic library of the future will provide discovery and delivery of this far-flung distributed network of resources that it holds or has access to on varying terms. That's always been an issue. In the good old days, you used to be able to look at other people's card catalogs in microfiche, right, and figure out for interlibrary loan whether you wanted to use those or not. But it is now going to be the case, especially to the extent that we work out good rights to use digitized materials of various kinds, most importantly the literature of the 20th century, which is invisible to us and to our students, as Pam pointed out so vigorously, that we will, if we can figure out how to use them, we're still going to require programming skill to figure out how to keep it current, usable, discoverable, etc. None of this is going to be automatic or quasi-automatic in the sense that it was in print. And as I've said, one of the things I've learned in my brief sojourn as a librarian is that discovery is hard enough even if you control the physical stock. It's much harder when the stuff comes from all over the place. Similarly, distributed preservation. We think of preservation as natural, right? It isn't, especially if you don't own the things. That's going to be a differentiator between, I think DPLA will preserve the metadata records, which are the heart of it. The Hathi Trust has over 10 million volumes, and a key piece of its mission is to preserve those digital records to academic library standards, which are very high standards. Most of the records, actually most of the files, come from Google. Google is interested in preservation and might not be forever. We're interested in preservation forever because that's the mission, because we have this commitment to scholarly work and to the future. And so it's vital for a library that the things that are used today by scholars are available to discuss, check against 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And so an implication of all of this is that there will be more collective work that should be done, hard work, shared with shared outcomes. The Google settlement would have made a large fraction of the published academic work easily available to all patrons of academic libraries in the United States. In time, we'll get back there, but it may be a lot of time. And it's the ambition of the Digital Public Library of America, the Hathi Trust, many other institutions, to get towards that. And it will get towards it for substantial chunks of the literature, but the copyright issue, as lots of us have pointed out today, is serious. And here I want to talk for just a moment. So sharing is an essential technology of libraries. Right? Libraries share with their patrons. Libraries share with each other. But the style of the sharing is often something that I've taken to calling noblesse oblige sharing. Right? I got this thing. It's a really nice thing. And you'd like to borrow it from me, and you're a nice person, and you even have the right to borrow it from me, and you're, kind of like, you're the right sort of person to lend stuff to. So I'm going to lend you this thing, which is mine. And you can have it for a while, and you can make it available to your patrons, or you can be one of mine, and then you're going to give me back this thing, which is mine. And that is and there's a lot of generosity there, but it's something less than perfect generosity. There are enormous opportunities in the library world in the future right now where we could really winnow down to many fewer copies of things that absolutely we have a duty to hold on to and make available and make present and preserve. No question about it. But many fewer copies, if we could agree, actually I'm going to lend this thing to the collective. Other people are going to be lending their things to the collective too. We're going to agree on joint ownership of that collective. Anytime any one of our faculty wants to use the physical object, it's absolutely going to be available. There are going to be 3 copies on different tectonic plates, right? Probably none of them on this one. This isn't a very good tectonic plate to be on. Didn't mean that. And that is, there are enormous efficiencies to be gained there at very little loss, but especially if there's a digital copy that you can read. And yet that is very hard to do. We're getting there. There's more of it, but that's one of the things that's gone a lot slower over the last 10 years than I thought it would be. When we do get there, when we are broadly sharing use versions of much of our collections, which I think we will, then the differentiation among libraries will increasingly be on their services and special, distinct collections, which isn't necessarily the same thing as special collections, right? But those are collections that are, for one reason or another, unique or nearly unique to a particular institution. And that's fine. That's even fun. We don't have to differentiate on the parts we don't have to differentiate on. And that gives us more room, I think, actually, to do the hard, detailed work of a great research library well. But it feels scary, right? Because our history is in great and only partially duplicated collections, rather than in collections that are shared across places in the kind of way I'm talking about. And that's because the technology absolutely wouldn't have supported the kind of sharing I'm talking about until very recently. So it makes a lot of difference how many volumes and what volumes the University of California at Berkeley has relative to some other institutions. An important part of what allows you to do good work here. And what I want to emphasize is that should be the standard of evaluation. Do you have what's required to be able to do good work here, supported by this library with good subject specialists who understand what the library is up to, what the resources can be used for? Do you have that? That's much more important than the specific location of all of the things that are available, but that you might not have. I'm going to try to speed up a little here. Just to note the traditional functions of the library, what the library does, what academics do is we learn things, or we think we learn things, we put them in the library to have those things be used by others, we hope, and then have one's intellectual offspring and their offspring and critics find it and cite it reliably, and to do it in a way that is actually current with current technology. And actually libraries are much more agile about making current technology practical than anyone else in the academy that I've met. And this is indeed, and that'll continue to be true, and it's indeed one of the continuing functions of libraries. But a lot of this is effectively done at a national and international scale, in which the great libraries and their appropriately demanding clients, it's vital that the faculty be absolutely insistent that the library deliver to a high standard. Because actually that's much more persuasive to the provost than if the librarians say what they'd like to deliver to a high standard. But the libraries are nodes for innovation that can then propagate to the system. Pam talked about new activities, innovation in libraries. If you have several dozens of really good academic libraries, and each of them is, in the natural course of their work, learning how to build new gadgets and combine collections in interesting ways, you're going to get a lot of innovation in the system. And that's actually a pretty nice looking system. So now I want to talk about student life for just a moment. Because one of the things that the library has always done is provide resources that are easy for students to use, or at least relatively easy. These were, in the good old days, up until and including today, books and the expertise to use them. They also provided spaces to work and to play, and to do playful work, again, using books and other things as well. The library is the student's best office, right? The student's going to go to work in the morning, well, not the morning, the student's going to go to work in the afternoon, and she's as likely as not going to go to the library. We used to have segregated undergraduate libraries with duplicate collections because we were terribly afraid that peanut butter might somehow get into the main research library. We seem to be less worried about that now. And so lots of places, Michigan's one of them, have thinned out the collection in what was the undergraduate library. And there's a coffee joint, and there's a video production facility, and there's a great big scanner for people to use, and a huge printer for them to make banners. So just like the books, right, those things, those big gadgets, are things that it makes a lot of sense to share. Libraries in a good central location. The students are already there because it's their best office. It's a very good place to put that kind of equipment and be able to try to integrate its use with the academic mission as well. We have a coffee joint that's open into the wee hours most days, 24 hours around exam period. We have two buildings. We have sort of a split campus, but the main library, the library next to it, is open 24/7, and then on North Campus, where the engineers live, and they don't come to the library to read. Actually, they do other things there. There's also a library that's open 24/7. So there's two places on campus where students can always go and usually get coffee, and that actually works well. And it's actually fun to watch the libraries that are open 24 hours through the cycle of the day. So 8 o'clock in the morning, there are no students there. The staff come in, drink coffee and do some work. And then slowly, shortly after noon, some students start to materialize. And the crowd gets younger and louder as the day goes on. And then eventually it's all young. And then it gets quieter because at 2 in the morning, actually, if you're in the library, there's probably quiet things you want to do, and then the whole thing starts over again. Okay, so we want to give, it's the best office for students. It's their best office. We want to give them safe and comfortable spaces in which they can work. And if there are librarians and academic resources around, that's really good because we'd like the students to take advantage of those things. We want to be their best office. So fundamentally, the libraries are and have always been, they're about access to things, some of which must be robustly preserved and delivered and curated, some of which are more evanescent. It makes sense to cluster those things, their economies of scope, to be a welcoming place with lots of relevant expertise, as many of the things will actually be, and we note that many of the things we use will actually be ported in from elsewhere. You can interpret the video studios and coffee joints as new activities, but I'd argue they're not so new in the purposes that they serve. The library has always been, now I'm talking like an economist because I am one, a production facility. People write there using the texts and the other facilities of the library. They produce scholarship. Okay, now they also produce video. Video is also an instrument of scholarship. There's nothing wrong with that. They still read books, at least some of the time. And it's good for us to expand our notion of what we're up to, I think, to include these things. We also want students to be good at sources and methods, at scholarly literacy, about being able to establish whether or not the thing that they think they learned actually has a good source to it. Again, Peter talked earlier about basically getting good footnotes as being the criterion for, what was the, what your daughter was up to? Trivia. That's exactly, that's a great idea. That's exactly what we ought to be doing. The faculty and the library, the biggest problem, I think, for education in the digital age is teaching students how to evaluate whether their sources are any good and actually making them care whether their sources are any good, rather than running for Congress or something. And so, librarians and faculty ought to be joined at the hip at this, but librarians are way more customer-oriented and way more agile at being able to keep up with the technology here. And that should be an important joint development, I think, of curriculum between faculty and libraries. And indeed, a lot of teaching can go on in the library. People thought I would talk about publishing, but I'm not going to, except to say that publishing is, of course, an essential element of scholarship. Right? Publish or perish is actually a moral imperative rather than a sort of sadistic admonition. And the library, which knows something about how people use published literature, is quite a natural place to put especially new kinds of publishing ventures, academic publishing ventures. So, big message, the tight links between library functions and their locations and physical collections has been loosening and will continue to loosen. One can still have excellent specialized service. Subject specialists are utterly vital in shared locations, and indeed you can improve the quality of service working in shared locations. And this is true at campus scale, at discipline scale, at academy-wide scale, at all scales. We want to figure out how to do a better job of sharing. So the future depends on helping to build institutions like the DPLA that will help with the sharing, and also specializing in one's own local work in the context of this changing overall system. And the best way for the library to deliver to faculty and students is to take advantage of digital technologies, which are great sharing tools. Boy, they're easy to copy and distribute. Shaping their use and innovating while also assuming the kind of bibliographic quality and reliability that are essential to learning and scholarship and that nobody cares about except the academy, and really nobody knows how to deliver except librarians. Thanks.
Thank you. I think everyone is buzzing now with the thoughts that have been presented here. I found them very stimulating, but I think there are still a few unanswered questions. I want to ask first, though, to Bob Darnton. Would you like to comment on anything? You've got a mic right there.
My comment would take the form of a question. As I'm sure everyone knows, Paul has been a great leader in the creation of Hathi Trust, which I think is a triumphant attempt to deal with the digital future. And we have Peter and others here from Google. So my question is, as we've got representatives from both Hathi and from Google, would you get together and give your collections to the DPLA?
That's not at my grade level. I'd be happy to do it, but not my call.
I think we'll probably, in time, be able to work something out with Hathi. There are niggling little issues about who has rights to what pieces. You know how it is. But it's clearly, for the public domain work, in my view, the right way to go. It's true that if we had a green light from Google on one technical point, it would be easier to do. So there's a conversation to be had there.
Could you explain the technical point? Or is it too not worth it?
I think this is one of those moments where if I were to explain the technical point, I'd probably want my lawyer to be in the room, which is no fun. No fun at all. He's a nice guy, but it still wouldn't be any fun.
So, I mean, by way of background, when Google went, Google came first to Harvard and the New York Public Library, to Michigan, to Cal, to Stanford, and that led to this marvelous digitizing effort you all know about. Each library received, in return for making its library physical copies available to Google, a so-called library digital copy. Now, those copies are extremely important and valuable, but they have to be preserved, and most libraries don't have adequate preservation facilities for electronic texts, which, as you know, come apart for various reasons and become antiquated rapidly, although Peter didn't seem too worried about the preservation problem. Myself, I am worried. In any case, these library digital copies involve contracts between Google and each library. So there are a series of separate contracts. They're all secret, or almost all secret, not in the case of Michigan. And so you've got this, the library digital copies are all deposited in Hathi. And that's the magnificent database, which now is something like 10 million volumes, getting bigger all the time. So we've got the beginnings, actually, of a kind of national digital library, but the contracts do not make it possible for Hathi to make these works available. And of course, if it did make the works available, it would be exposed to litigation if any of the works were deemed to be covered by copyright, the same problem Google had in the beginning. So we've got problems all over the place, but we have possibilities at the same time. And I hope that sometime within the next few years, these basic problems will be worked out, maybe through case law and a series of litigations, and maybe even, who knows, new legislation on orphan books or more, if Congress can ever pass any legislation on anything. But this is a very important turning point, and I think we should all be aware of the what's at stake.
Let me just add one piece to that. So making the Hadi Trust itself will, I think that in due course and not too long, the public domain works that are in the Hadi Trust will be available through the DPLA on some reasonable terms. Whether they'll be available for bulk download or not, I think that would require negotiations with Google. But available to read, I think, is something we probably can deliver. Then there are some secondary issues about the terms under which the Hadi Trust universities can contribute catalog data, metadata, to the DPLA, and that's also being worked on. So what did I say? There were things that I thought 10 years ago would have happened by now that wouldn't. This one, I think, within a year, on some reasonable terms, I think we're very likely to have access to most of the public domain content.
Yeah. Of course, we can already get it from Google.
Yeah, sorry, you can already get it from Hadi Trust too, but pointing at it from the DPLA would be very nice.
I have a feeling we're experiencing history being made right in this room tonight.
I have to say I can't speak for Hadi Trust. I'm on the board, but you know.
We'll lock the doors until they settle.
There you go.
We're going to call for questions from all of you now. I see lots of hands starting to fire up here. I'm going to bow to our subgroup chair on collections first. Panos, please.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Darnton. I would like to run a little thought experiment on the DPLA. So I would like to assume that you find your financing for 10 years so you can proceed with the work, that the affiliated libraries find the financing needed to continue doing the digital work that will ultimately be aggregated at DPLA, and that all the legal impediments that are currently in place are somehow going to be resolved in favor of DPLA. So in 10 years from now, just to quote what you said, DPLA will contain the equivalent of the Library of Congress. The question that I have is, how would that be reflected in the mission of the Harvard Library?
I don't know if you heard in the back, the question was, if all of these prophecies come true in 10 years, how will that affect the mission of the Harvard University Library? Well, my first inclination is to say what matters is the public good. And Harvard has, in a way, acquired, I think somewhat unjustly, a reputation as an elite institution turned in on itself. It's got the world's greatest university library, about 18 million volumes, and isn't that wonderful for the faculty and students at Harvard? But what about the rest of the country and the world? Well, I think that this enormous asset, 18 million volumes, is a national asset. And if I had one word to describe my own policies as university librarian, it is open up and share our intellectual wealth. So if it all floods into the DPLA, I would say wonderful. Meanwhile, though, I think part of Harvard's responsibility to the world of learning is in developing what Paul rightly characterized as distinctive and also special collections, including manuscript collections, including the processing of manuscript collections. We have 35 miles of manuscript at Harvard, most of it not yet processed, and a lot of it having to do with the origins of education in the United States and the origin of the United States. But very few people have seen this. So we have a job cut out for us at Harvard in developing our special collections, our manuscript collections, building to strength, and furthermore, in collecting in foreign languages. Now, Google is wonderful in the way it has been digitizing all over the world, but of course, each time there's another contractual agreement. The latest one that's caused a lot of controversy is in France between Google and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and it is an exclusive agreement. So a lot of French people are unhappy about this. Well, Harvard, 60% of Harvard's collections are in languages other than English. And so we will continue to collect heavily in the non-obvious places. Here at Berkeley, you've got a great collection or series of collections in Japanese and Chinese and Korean. And I think it's incumbent upon Berkeley to continue to build to that strength. So I think that the mission of Harvard is dual. One, open up the collections and share them with the rest of the world. But two, meanwhile, develop your particular strengths.
Thank you. The noblest motive is the public good. We're going to go on this side, then we'll bounce back to that side. I saw a hand. Yes, please. Stand up if you will and shout out.
Hi. So I'm an undergraduate, particularly concerned with developing curriculums that acquaint undergraduates with research methods and actually accessing these sources and collections. So I know that earlier Tom Leonard addressed the fact that the idea of undergraduate access, even let alone research inside of these, at these top research librarians is a pretty new concept. So, question I have is in developing these skills of, information literacy and accessing these collections, do you think that the pedagogical burden will fall mostly to faculty, or will that be part of the evolving role of librarians in the 21st century?
So the question was, would the skills associated with doing research, especially for undergraduates, fall principally to librarians or principally to faculty as they develop, this being a relatively new thing in undergraduate education, although there's always been some trace of it in undergraduate education everywhere, for sure. And my answer is, I don't know. It will be most effective if both are involved. So it'll be most effective if faculty are really interested in students learning how to do high-level research using scholarly materials. And it'll be most effective if librarians are really there to help with how that relates to the various assets that we would expect to have access to. And so I think generalized information literacy isn't nearly as interesting as getting down with a real research project. And so what you want to have is lots of faculty teaching undergraduate courses that require this kind of work, and then faculty and library support to get it done.
If I may just quickly add a word, I totally agree with what Paul said. I teach a course on the history of books at Harvard. We meet inside the rare book library. It's for freshmen, and the first 90 minutes involve seminar discussion of reading, that kind of thing. The last 90 minutes are always done by librarians who bring in the books. And it's from Gutenberg to the internet. The librarian arrives at the first session with a Gutenberg Bible under his arm and plunks it down on the table. And then we invite the students in, well, they're sitting around the table, to not just stand back and admire this famous work, but to come up and turn the pages. And then we ask them questions such as, what do you make of the pagination? And then they notice there isn't any pagination. Why? In other words, the point is not just to admire a treasure, but to learn to read typography and page design as something that conveys meaning. Well, you need a librarian who can, first of all, produce, maybe not the Gutenberg Bible, but every great library has some valuable treasure of that sort. And you need and I always plan these sessions with the librarian, so I really feel that we collaborate intensely. And the students find, for some reason, that the librarians are much more interesting than I am.
We have one more question from this side, way in the back, I think.
Thank you, Gary. I really appreciate Paul talking about student use of libraries. On the commission, we really worked quite hard to try and get an understanding of how undergraduates, graduate colleagues, PhDs, and masters in professional schools use libraries. And it's complicated because there are enormous variations. But one of the things that has come across to us, and I see nothing but others in talking to us, was that access to digital materials invariably, and I qualify that, but usually, results in printing it out. So, at considerable cost to the student now. Or otherwise to the department. And I see my new dean is here from the School of Social Welfare, and is assigned now on our lab, no printing out of V-Space and library materials. I wondered if you had experience with that at Harvard and at Michigan, or whether you think that this is something that we should be thinking about in terms of helping our students with the costs that are involved. Thank you.
So, at one level, the question was basically, in thinking about undergraduate use, student use, not just undergraduate use of libraries, one of the things that one often finds is that what people do when they find a resource that they're interested in is they print it out. Apparently, under the current model here, that's expensive to the student, or if not to the student, to somebody. And indeed, the cost of printing hasn't fallen as quickly as the cost of almost everything else in the digital world, partly because there are real physical processes involved in printing. And then the question was, so should we be thinking about some kind of support for printing? And I don't know. I'm interested, actually, as a member of the commission, to be involved in that discussion. I do know that if you give away X number of pages of free printing in a semester, students will be very smart about optimizing such that students who want to use something less than X are able to transfer those rights over to students who want to use something more. So the number of pages printed will be S, where S is the number of students, times X within about within about 1 or 2. So if X is a big number, that's going to get very pricey. Whether you want to have some subsidies, some subventions for particular kinds of printing, or better screens, I think this becomes a complicated resource management question. If it sounds like I'm temporizing, that's what I'm doing.
So I think we're time for the break now. So I want to thank our two very distinguished speakers.